Hey everyone, welcome back to InfoGamer. For this lesson, we're going to keep learning how to use Unity. In this video, we want to talk about UI game objects or user interface game objects. So let's get started. So here we have our tutorial project open inside of Unity, and I want to first start off by saying that Unity provides a lot of different UI game objects. Now, if you've never heard of the term UI before, it stands for user interface. Now, a user interface is typically any element of your video game that the player can directly interact with. This includes things like menu systems and overlaid HUDs. Now, a lot of times UI game objects are overlaid on top of what your camera is capturing in your scene view, but it doesn't always have to overlay on top of your camera. So now that you have a simple definition of what a UI game object is, let's look at a few of them. So to bring up the list of all the default UI game objects, let's go to the game object drop-down menu and then select UI. You can see that there's this additional pop-out menu. So as you can see here, there's things like text game objects and image game objects, which are not interactable. But then there's also things like buttons, toggles, sliders, which are all interactable. Now let's start by creating the base UI game object, which is the canvas. Once you create a canvas game object, you can see that within your scene, there's this big white box, and it's really big in scale. Now by default, the canvas that we've just now created is set to screen space overlay, which means that all of the UI elements that we add to the canvas will be overlaid on top of our active camera. Now you can change the render mode of your canvas through this drop-down menu here, which provides three different options. There's screen space overlay, screen space camera, and world space. Now the two settings that I use the most often are screen space overlay and world space. The world space setting makes it so that rather than everything in your canvas being overlaid on top of your camera, the canvas becomes something more like a 2D image inside your game. The only difference is that this 2D image will have interactable components. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to switch the render mode back to screen space overlay. Now going back to our scene view, there is this big white box that is now visible within our scene. Now this big white box, you can tell that it is in the same aspect ratio as our game view window. And when I have our game view window set to free aspect, you can see that when I adjust the size of our game view window, it adjusts the white box in our scene view the same way. This is because this white box is mapped to the dimensions of our camera's projection. Now I want you to think of this big white box as the workstation for all the UI elements that you're going to add to your game. And this will become more apparent once we add more UI game objects to our canvas. Now the last thing that I want to mention about the canvas game object is that when you're building a video game inside of Unity, you should have some sort of idea of what kind of aspect ratio you're going to be using. And if you know beforehand what that aspect ratio is, then you should set it inside your game view. So for example, if I set our aspect ratio to something like 16:9, you can see how the projection of our camera changes so that our screen always has a ratio of 16 in width by 9 in height. And just as our game view changes, you can see how the white box in our scene view has also changed to have a ratio of 16 in width by 9 in height. But once you pick an aspect ratio that you want your game to be built for, let's go over to the inspector, and within the component called Canvas Scaler, we want to select the UI scale mode to scale with screen size. Now this makes it so that you can pick a starting resolution that you want your canvas to be referenced to, and then as you build the game for different devices with different aspect ratios, the canvas will scale properly to those different aspect ratios. And so for the reference resolution for X, I'm going to put 1920, and for Y, I'm going to put 1080. This is a valuable principle that I wish I knew from the very beginning when I started working with UI game objects. Now that's everything that we want to talk about with regards to the standard canvas game object. We'll talk more about the different settings in the inspector as we cover each component individually. The next thing that we want to do is talk about some of the other standard UI game objects that Unity provides. So I'm going to go ahead and create those game objects, and then we'll talk about them. Alright, so here I've gone ahead and created all the different standard UI game objects that Unity provides. Now one thing that I also did change was the resolution of our canvas scaler. I made it a little bit smaller. I made it 720p so that the individual UI game objects would be a little bit bigger in size to begin with. Now the purpose of this video is to talk about UI game objects generally so that you can have a better understanding of what they are and what is available to you. In the future, we'll put out a video on each one of these game objects so that we can explain them more in depth. Now each one of these standard UI game objects have some commonalities. For one, they're all game objects. For two, they all have transforms, but you'll notice that when we select one of our UI game objects, that within the inspector, this transform looks a lot different than just a standard game object's transform. This transform is what's called a Rect Transform. Now a standard game object's transform just deals with the position, the rotation, and the scale of that game object. Whereas with the UI game object, you need to know a little bit more information about the transform. Now currently I have the panel UI game object selected, and if we look in the inspector at the Rect Transform component, we'll notice a few things. First off, I want to draw your attention to the anchor settings. Now the anchor settings deal with how you want this UI game object to scale with different aspect ratios. When we look inside the scene view, the anchors of this game object are indicated by these white triangles in the four corners of our canvas. The anchor settings allow you to specify a percentage of the parent UI game object that you want this UI game object to occupy. So currently we have the min values of x and y set to 0 and the max values of x and y set to 1. This means that we want our panel's anchors to take up 100% of the parent UI game object, which is the canvas. This is why the anchor gizmos are positioned at the corners of our canvas in the scene view. Now when your anchors are not at the same position as we have here with our panel game object, you'll notice that rather than having an x, y, and z position for our transform, instead we have a left, top, and then a position z, and then right and bottom. This allows you to have a pixel distance that you want between the edges of your image and the anchor points. So if I set our left, top, right, and bottom all to the value of 100, you'll notice that the image of our panel has now kind of shrunk, and there's actually 100 pixels between all the sides of our image and the sides of our canvas. Another thing that you want to know about the anchors and positioning of the Rect Transform is that if you have the anchors set to the same position, so I can use this anchor preset drop-down menu to select the center of our canvas. And once I do that, you'll notice how the settings have changed. So now we do have a position for the X, the Y, and the Z, and then we also have a width and height. So the width is pretty simple. That's the pixel width of this image. The height is pretty simple. That's the pixel height of this image. And then the X position, Y position, and Z position work the same way as any other game object. The only difference is that it is in relation to the position of the anchors. And so right now, the center of our image is at the center of our anchor points. Now I'll leave it up to you to play with the settings of the Rect Transform component so that you can get more familiar with it. In addition to these Rect Transform settings that we've already talked about, we can also set the position of our pivot for our UI game object, and we can also set the rotation and scale of the UI game object. Now just remember that all UI game objects will have a Rect Transform component instead of a regular transform component. Another similarity between all UI game objects excluding the canvas is the canvas renderer component. This is a component that is required for all UI game objects with visual features. So for example, our panel game object has this component, which is a UI component called image. And because this is a visual component, our panel game object is required to have the canvas renderer component as well. This allows the canvas to then display the visual features. Now for the most part, you don't even need to worry about the canvas renderer component because anytime you add a visual UI component to a game object, it will also add the canvas renderer component. Now that's everything the standard UI game objects have in common, but let's run through this list of standard game objects and talk about each one. Now the first one is the panel game object, and the panel game object is pretty much the same thing as the UI image game object. The only difference is that when you create a panel game object, the anchors are in the four corners of the canvas, whereas when you create an image, they're in the center. Another difference between the panel and the image is the source image that's being used. With the panel, it's set to the default background image, which gives it a little black line border. And then the color of the image component is another difference, where the alpha channel of the panel is set to the value of 100. Now I'm actually going to set the alpha channel to 255 so it's solid, and then I'm going to change the color so that all the other UI game objects show up a little bit better. Now let's move over to the image game object. Now the image game object is pretty much the same thing as the panel game object. The only difference is that the size of the image starts out as being 100 in width and 100 in height, and its anchors are set to the center of the canvas. And then it does not have a source image for the image component, and its color is set to a solid white. Now you'll notice that the sprite component requires a sprite for the source image field. And so I'm going to go ahead and just drag in our Contra character to that field there, and you'll notice how it changes in the scene. The next one that we wanted to talk about is the raw image. The raw image is pretty much the same thing as the image game object. The only difference is that rather than having an image component, it has a raw image component. And the raw image component is pretty much the same thing as the image component, only the raw image allows you to apply textures. And here we have a texture image that I've saved into our project, and I'm just going to drag that into the texture field. And there we go, we now have a texture applied to this raw image. The next game object that we want to talk about is the text game object. Now the text game object, rather than having an image component, has a text component. This allows you to type in any text to the text field. So I'm going to just type hello world. This also allows you to change things like the font and the font size. But to make this text game object show up a little bit better in our scene view, I'm going to select the best fit setting. And there we go, we can now read hello world. Right, you can also change the alignment and the color of your text. Now that's all the UI game objects that are not interactable. Let's talk about the interactable game objects. So first off, we have the button. Now the button game object is pretty straightforward. It is an image game object with a button component attached, and then a text game object as a child to it. Now the special thing about the button component is that it allows you to call a function from your scripts when the button is clicked. Now moving on to the toggle game object, the toggle is a little more complex than the button. It's made up from several different UI game objects. First off, the parent game object has a toggle component attached to it. Now the toggle component allows you to send a true or false value to a function that you call in your scripts. The child game objects to the toggle include two image game objects. One is the background image for the checkbox, and the other is the checkmark itself. The toggle also includes a text game object for the label of the checkbox. Moving on to the slider game object, the slider game object is even more complex than the toggle. The parent game object has a slider component attached to it, which allows you to call a function when the value of the slider is changed, and it passes in the value of the slider to that function as a parameter. The child game objects for the slider include one image game object for the background. It also includes an empty game object called the fill area, and a child to that game object is another image game object called the fill, which increases with the size of where the slider is positioned. So you can have one side of your slider colored and have it fill up as you drag the slider. The last child game object is called the handle slider area, which is an empty game object, and below that is an image game object called the handle. This is the actual grabbable part of the slider. Moving on to the scroll bar in a way is similar to the slider, but instead of having a slider script, it has a scroll bar script. And the scroll bar component as well allows you to call a function when you change the value of where the slider is on the scroll bar. The child game objects to the scroll bar include an empty game object called the sliding area, and then the handle, which is an image game object, and this is the actual grabbable area of your scroll bar. Moving on to the drop-down game object, this game object allows you to create a drop-down menu where you can provide a number of different options to select. This is an image game object with a drop-down component attached to it, and you can see in the drop-down component that you can assign different options and it will populate the drop-down menu with these different options. You can then call a function in your scripts when different options are selected. The child game objects to this include a label, which is a text game object, an arrow, which is just an image game object, and then the template game object, which is a scroll rect game object, but by default it's set to be disabled. The next game object is an input field. This allows the user to type in a value. This is a simple image game object with an input field component attached to it, and the input field component allows you to call a function when the value is changed and when the value is submitted. The child game objects for this one are two text game objects. The first one is the placeholder, which currently says enter text, and the second one is the actual text value that the users will be entering in. The last game object is a scroll view game object, which is an image game object with the scroll rect component attached to it. This game object allows you to have movable UI content in the scroll view area. The child game objects to this one include the viewport game object, which is where all the content will go, and then two scroll bars. So that's all the standard UI game objects that Unity provides. I hope you're able to see how you can rearrange all these UI game objects to create things like menus and overlay HUDs. Now that's everything that we're going to cover in this video about user interfaces. I hope you now have a better understanding of what they are and how they're used. If you have any questions, make sure that you leave them in the comments below. Also make sure that you like this video and subscribe to our channel so you can get regular notifications when we publish new videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.